For decades, the American middle class was told one simple story: work hard, stay responsible, and life would slowly get better. That story didn't collapse overnight. It didn't end with a single crisis. It just stopped working. Today, millions of middle-class families are doing everything right, working full-time, budgeting carefully, making sacrifices, and still falling behind. Not because they failed, but because the system quietly changed the rules. How the middle class began to lose its footing. The slow death of the American middle class did not begin with a crash. It began with pressure, small at first, easy to dismiss. Rising costs here, stagnant wages there, changes that felt temporary. The kind people believed they could outwork, outweight, or outsmart. For a long time they did. The middle class has always been defined by balance. Not wealth, not poverty, but margin. Enough income to cover necessities, absorb shocks, and plan ahead. Enough stability to believe that effort today would translate into security tomorrow. That margin is what made the middle class feel solid, and that margin is what quietly disappeared. There was no announcement when it happened, no policy that officially ended it, no single year you can point to and say, this was the moment. Instead, the middle class was slowly asked to absorb more responsibility, more risk, and more cost, without receiving more protection in return. At first, the trade-off seemed manageable. 2 incomes replaced 1, commutes grew longer, work followed people home. These adjustments were framed as progress, flexibility, opportunity, modern life. But beneath the surface, they signaled a shift. Stability was no longer built into the system. It had to be constantly maintained by individuals. Housing was one of the first stress points. For decades, owning a home anchored the middle class. It offered predictability, fixed payments, a sense of permanence. But over time, that predictability eroded. Prices climbed faster than wages. Down payments grew harder to reach. Property taxes rose quietly. Insurance costs crept up. Home ownership stopped feeling like a milestone and started feeling like a gamble. Renters felt the shift even faster. Lease renewals brought uncertainty instead of routine. Rent increases arrived with little explanation. Moving became common, not because people wanted to upgrade, but because staying became unaffordable. Housing stopped being a foundation. It became a variable. Healthcare followed a similar path. Insurance remained widespread on paper, but coverage grew thinner in practice. Deductibles increased, networks narrowed, out-of-pocket costs multiplied. A single medical event could erase years of careful budgeting. So people adapted. They delayed care, skipped appointments, ignored symptoms. Not because they didn't value health, but because interacting with the system felt financially dangerous. This kind of adaptation became normal. The middle class didn't lose access overnight, it lost reliability. And reliability is what turns systems into safety nets. Work, once the primary source of security, also changed shape. Jobs still existed. Employment numbers remained healthy, but the relationship between work and stability weakened. Raises lagged behind inflation. Benefits shrank quietly. Hours became unpredictable. Contracts replaced careers. The promise was no longer, work hard and you'll be okay. It became, work hard and hope nothing goes wrong. That subtle shift matters, because hope is not the same as security. As expenses rose, debt filled the gap. Not luxury debt, survival debt. Credit cards used for groceries. Medical bills placed on payment plans. Buy now, pay later options replacing savings. Debt stopped being a bridge to the future. It became part of the present. And when debt becomes normal, anxiety becomes constant. The middle class learned to live under that anxiety. Bills were paid, life continued. But the feeling of forward motion faded. Progress became harder to define. Success felt fragile. This pressure reshaped behavior. People stopped planning far ahead. 5-year goals felt optimistic. 10-year goals felt unrealistic. Decisions became short-term and defensive. Risk-taking declined. Stability became something to protect, not something to build. Even education, long considered the great equalizer, began to feel uncertain. Degrees grew more expensive, outcomes became less predictable. Debt followed graduates for decades. Education didn't lose value, its guarantee did. This created a generation that didn't reject effort, but questioned its payoff. People still worked, they still tried, but they adjusted expectations downward. Lower risk, smaller dreams, more caution. This wasn't laziness. It was rational adaptation to an environment that punished mistakes more harshly than it rewarded success. Social life felt the impact too. As financial pressure increased, time and energy shrank. Socializing became expensive. Community participation declined. People withdrew quietly, not because they didn't care, but because everything required calculation. Even joy became conditional. The middle class didn't stop functioning. It stopped breathing. What makes this transformation so difficult to recognize is that nothing visibly broke. Stores stayed open, roads were maintained, paychecks arrived. On the surface, society looked stable. But underneath, the margin that once absorbed shocks was gone. When a car repair creates crisis, when a medical bill creates fear, when a missed paycheck creates panic. That's not personal failure, that's structural fragility. The middle class wasn't destroyed by a single blow, it was slowly thinned out. Asked to carry rising costs without rising protection, increasing responsibility without increasing reward. People adjusted because they had to. They learned to live tighter lives. They learned to expect less. They learned to endure. And endurance became the defining feature of middle-class life. But endurance has limits. Because when stability becomes something you constantly defend, it changes how you see the future. It changes how much risk you're willing to take. It changes how much faith you place in institutions, in work, and in the idea that things will improve. This is where the slow death truly begins. Not with collapse, but with acceptance. Acceptance that life will be harder. Acceptance that progress is uncertain. Acceptance that security is fragile. By the time people realize how much has changed, the system no longer feels broken. It feels normal. And that normalization is what carries this story forward into the psychological and cultural consequences that come next. When survival replaced progress. Once endurance becomes normal, behavior begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. The middle class didn't stop believing in work, education, or responsibility. It stopped believing that those things guaranteed forward movement. And when that belief weakens, people don't rebel, they retreat. The first thing that disappears is long-term thinking. 5-year plans begin to feel unrealistic. 10-year plans feel almost naive. People stop asking where they want to be and start asking what they can safely maintain. Stability turns into a defensive position. Jobs are no longer viewed as pathways. They are viewed as lifelines. People stay not because they're growing, but because leaving feels too risky. Loyalty becomes caution. Ambition becomes exposure. This is why job satisfaction declines even when employment numbers look strong. People are working, but they're not investing themselves. They show up, they perform, they comply. But emotionally, they pull back. Careers fragment into a series of short-term decisions rather than a coherent arc. Job hopping increases, not for advancement, but for survival. People chase marginal gains in pay or benefits, knowing that none of it creates real security. Work becomes transactional, and transactions don't inspire loyalty or pride. This shift spills into family life. Marriage gets delayed. Children feel financially overwhelming. Home ownership feels out of reach or too risky. Life milestones that once marked progress now feel like liabilities. People don't reject these milestones. They postpone them indefinitely. This postponement reshapes society in subtle ways. Communities age unevenly. Birth rates decline. Extended families scatter as people move for affordability rather than opportunity. Life becomes provisional. Even relationships begin to carry economic weight. Support systems thin out because everyone is stretched. Helping others feels harder when you're barely holding yourself together. This doesn't mean people stop caring. It means they have less capacity. Education reflects the same pattern. Degrees still matter, but they no longer feel like guarantees. Tuition rises faster than wages. Student debt lingers for decades. Outcomes depend increasingly on timing, networking, and luck. So people adapt. They choose safer majors, shorter programs, credentials designed to minimize risk rather than maximize growth. Curiosity narrows into practicality. Learning becomes defensive, not because people lack ambition, but because ambition has been punished too many times. This defensive mindset reshapes consumption as well. People spend carefully. They delay purchases. They avoid commitments. They maintain appearances while quietly cutting back. Restaurants feel expensive. Travel feels indulgent. Even small pleasures carry guilt. Life becomes optimized for cost control. This constant calculation creates mental exhaustion. Every month requires vigilance. Every bill demands attention. There is no sense of catching up, only staying afloat. The system doesn't feel hostile. It feels relentless. Debt reinforces this cycle. Credit fills gaps that wages no longer cover. What starts as temporary assistance becomes permanent reliance. Interest compounds quietly. Payments become part of the monthly baseline. Debt doesn't create immediate collapse. It creates long-term immobility. People can't afford mistakes. They can't afford breaks. They can't afford to step off the treadmill. So they keep going. Not toward something better, but away from something worse. This is how a society continues functioning while losing momentum. From the outside, everything looks normal. People go to work. Stores are open. The economy moves. But underneath, confidence erodes. People stop believing that participation leads to progress. They still participate. They just stop expecting reward. Institutions often misread this shift. Lower engagement is blamed on attitude. Lower loyalty is blamed on culture. Lower optimism is blamed on generational weakness. But the cause isn't cultural, it's structural. When a system demands constant effort just to maintain basic stability, people naturally conserve energy. They reduce risk, they narrow their lives, they pull back emotionally. This isn't apathy, it's self-preservation. As this mindset spreads, trust weakens. People trust employers less, landlords less, insurers less. Even long-standing institutions feel distant and unreliable, so people hedge everything. They assume disruption. They expect disappointment. They plan for instability. This constant defensive posture becomes exhausting, but it also becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, it's incredibly difficult to reverse. Because recovery isn't just about improving numbers, it's about restoring belief. And belief does not automatically return when conditions improve. Once people learn to expect fragility, they carry that expectation forward. They don't rush back into risk. They don't rebuild trust easily. They don't expand their lives quickly. The damage lingers. This is why the slow death of the middle class isn't measured in headlines or quarterly data. It's measured in behavior, in the decisions people don't make, in the risks they avoid, in the futures they stop imagining. And as this quiet withdrawal continues, it reshapes the culture itself. A society built on progress slowly turns into a society built on management, managing risk, managing cost, managing decline. That transformation doesn't create outrage. It creates resignation. And resignation is far more dangerous, because once enough people accept that life will be smaller, tighter, and more fragile, the system no longer faces resistance. It simply continues. That brings us to the final stage of this story, where adaptation hardens into permanence, and where the consequences of this slow erosion become impossible to ignore. When the middle class stops believing. When a society reaches this stage, the damage is no longer just financial. It becomes psychological. The middle class doesn't disappear all at once. It continues to exist in name, in statistics, and in habit. People still work, they still pay bills, they still participate. But something essential fades underneath all of it. Belief. Belief that effort leads somewhere. Belief that stability is attainable. Belief that the future will be better than the present. Once that belief weakens, the system can keep functioning, but it stops progressing. This is the most misunderstood part of the middle class's decline. People assume collapse comes from chaos, anger, or revolt. But the slow death comes from acceptance, from learning how to live with less margin, less security, and less hope, and calling that adjustment maturity. The middle class adapts so well that its struggle becomes invisible. People don't protest because they're exhausted. They don't demand change because change feels risky. They don't imagine alternatives because imagination feels irresponsible. Instead, they optimize. They budget harder. They plan less. They lower expectations quietly. This creates a society that looks stable on the surface but feels brittle underneath. One unexpected expense can unravel years of careful planning. One health issue can reset an entire life. One job loss can erase a sense of identity built over decades. The system no longer absorbs shocks. Individuals do. And when individuals are asked to absorb systemic risk, inequality widens. Not dramatically, but persistently. Those with buffers survive turbulence. Those without internalize it. Over time, this creates invisible divisions. Two people can earn similar incomes and live in the same city, yet experience completely different realities, depending on how much margin they have. Margin becomes the new class line. Not income, not education, margin. This shift changes how people relate to institutions. Trust declines slowly. People trust employers less because loyalty hasn't been rewarded. They trust healthcare systems less because care feels conditional. They trust housing markets less because stability feels temporary. Even civic trust erodes. Not because people stop caring, but because participation hasn't delivered protection. This isn't apathy, it's fatigue. A tired society doesn't revolt, it withdraws. And withdrawal has consequences. When enough people stop believing that participation leads to progress, innovation slows, risk-taking declines, entrepreneurship becomes rare, creativity narrows. A society focused on survival cannot imagine boldly. And imagination is what once powered the middle class forward. The cultural impact is subtle but profound. People stop asking what kind of life they want. They ask what kind of life they can manage. Dreams shrink into strategies. Ambition turns into maintenance. The idea of getting ahead fades, replaced by the goal of not falling behind. This isn't a generational flaw. It's a rational response to a system that punishes missteps more harshly than it rewards success. The tragedy is that this adaptation stabilizes the system in the short term. People keep working. They keep consuming. They keep paying. But the long-term cost is momentum. The middle class once acted as the engine of optimism. It believed in progress because it experienced it. When that experience disappears, so does the engine. Economic growth becomes fragile. Social cohesion weakens. Political trust erodes, not because people are angry, but because they're disconnected. This is why restoring the middle class is so difficult. It's not just about wages, housing, or healthcare. Those matter, but they're only part of the problem. The deeper issue is belief. Once people learn to expect instability, they carry that expectation forward. Even if conditions improve, they remain cautious. They hesitate to commit. They delay risk. They protect what little stability they've built. Recovery becomes slower because confidence does not rebound automatically. This is the long shadow of the slow death. The middle class didn't lose everything. It lost its sense of trajectory. Life stopped feeling like a path and started feeling like a loop. Work, pay, manage, repeat. No collapse, no breakthrough, just endurance. And endurance, while admirable, is not a vision for the future. A society cannot thrive on endurance alone. Eventually, the cost becomes visible, not in dramatic failure, but in quiet stagnation. In a generation that expects less, in families that plan less, in communities that feel thinner and more isolated. The most dangerous part of this story is that it feels normal. People adjust so gradually that they don't notice how much has changed until they look back and realize how small their expectations have become. That is what makes the slow death of the American middle class so difficult to confront. There is no single villain, no single moment, no single fix. Just a system that asked ordinary people to carry more risk than they were ever meant to bear, and a population that adapted because it had no choice. The middle class didn't vanish. It learned how to survive without the guarantees that once defined it. And unless that reality is acknowledged honestly, the future won't bring collapse. It will bring more of the same. A quieter life, a narrower horizon, a society that still works, but no longer believes.